Kalispera σας. Good evening. I'm Maria Georgopoulou. I'm the director of the Gennadios Library, and it's a great joy for me to be here for our lecture tonight, where we have a very special guest, Benjamin Anderson from Cornell University, where he's associate professor of history of art and classics. Before I even start saying a few things from his CV, which is very extensive and he's quite accomplished, I wanted to thank him from this podium for his help with the Gennadios Library business. Ben Anderson is the chair of the programs committee for the Gennadios Library, and he's responsible for herding together a committee of people with very strong feelings, and but anyway, I mean, the programs of the Gennadios Library have expanded in recent years, and I truly am really thankful to the committee for all its help. And the programs are expanding, and so we look forward to working with them more. So Ben Anderson has a PhD from Bryn Mawr College, and as I said, he's an art historian, but he has also participated as a specialist in archaeological excavations in Sardis in 2019, and in the Avgat archaeological project in 2008-2009. And his dissertation and his first book is entitled Cosmos and Community in Early Medieval Art. Is a book that was published in 2017, and the book addresses astronomical imagery in early medieval Byzantine and Islamic art. As you will see and hear from his lecture tonight, but those of you who know his scholarship, Ben is very expansive in the way he views the world. He couldn't have written a book on the cosmos, obviously, without being so, but he really manages to see Byzantium and among its sort of neighboring people, and his linguistic skills and his interdisciplinary skills are truly amazing. So his book was awarded with the Charles Rufus Murray Book Award from College Art Association in 2019. Another thing that Ben is quite good at is to work together with people. And we have at least one of his collaborators in the room. So he has really started projects and edited books and volumes. One treating antiquarianism with Felipe Rojas and Byron Ellsworth Hamann, the archaeology of neighborhoods with Fotini Convili, the history of Byzantine study with Mirela Ivanova, and most recently Hagia Sophia with Emily Neumeyer, who is also no stranger to this public and to the Gennadios Library. He has also worked with the history of 18th and 19th century excavators and photographers, and how these ruins in the East, in the Near East, have been sort of seen and formed our way of looking at the world. And first he had a book with Bob Osterhout on Palmyra, 1885, the Wolf Expedition, and the photographs of John Henry Haynes. And his book on Robert Wood's 18th century studies on the ruins of Palmyra and Baalbek appeared in 2021. He has received awards from the Medieval Academy of America, CASVA, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, both as a pre-doc and as a scholar, a true scholar, from the Institute of Advanced Study and the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence. And last year he was symposiarch with Ivan Derpic for the Dumbarton Oaks Symposium of 2024, the Byzantine Portrait, Personhood and Representation. So when I asked him to come and talk to us, he offered a variety of topics, but I picked one that really made me very excited because it's a topic that is, again, quite important and interesting and really weaves together many parts of Byzantine history and beyond. So his lecture tonight is a preview of his work in progress, a book in progress, a study of the Byzantine oracles of Leo and their reception in early modern Europe, and is entitled, as you see, The Oracular Image from Byzantium to the Baroque. So please join me in having Ben Anderson to the podium.
I owe a great debt of gratitude to Maria Georgopoulou, as we all do, obviously for the invitation to come this evening, but for the work that she's done at the Gennadios to expand the programming and the fellowship opportunities. I mean, it's a really extraordinary honor to be able to join you here today. And many thanks also to Maria Smalley for the organization and the logistics for my visit. It's a real pleasure to be here. So in my talk this evening, I'd like to provide an overview of the 1,000-year history of the oracular image, from its emergence around the year 800 in Constantinople, through to its robust reception in later medieval and early modern Europe, and up to its eventual oblivion around the year 1800. As the story is somewhat complex and perhaps also unfamiliar, I would like to offer a little bit of a roadmap here at the start. So the talk will be in 3 parts. I will begin by offering a definition of the oracular image and an example by means of a story about the Byzantine Emperor Leo V. I will then move to the central part of the lecture, which traces the development and spread of the oracular image, both within Byzantium and beyond. And by way of conclusion, I will offer some brief remarks about the significance of the oracular image for our idea of Byzantine art and its reception in Europe. To begin then with the definition, an oracular image is an artifact made in the past by people, by humans. It is not divinely crafted, nor indeed is it divinely inspired. However, when correctly interpreted, it offers knowledge of future events, and above all, the fates of empires and of sovereigns. Thus defined, the oracular image emerges in Constantinople around the year 800, and it takes 2 primary forms. First, it can be a sculpture or a sculptural monument displayed in the streets of the city. For example, the column of Arcadius, shown here on the screen. Erected in the 5th century on the model of the column of Trajan, it was initially intended to celebrate the victories of the emperors. However, by the 8th century, it had been reinterpreted as a prophecy of future events, and in particular, the end of the Byzantine state. The second form adopted by the oracular image is that of the illuminated manuscript, whose images are understood to predict the fates of future emperors. The Byzantine books of this kind are not preserved. We only hear about them from the Byzantine historians. However, the genre is well represented by a large number of mostly 16th century manuscripts of the so-called oracles of Leo. The example that I show here on the screen is today in Amsterdam. The earliest stories about this second kind of oracular image concern the Emperor Leo V, sometimes called Leo the Armenian, who ruled from 813 to 820. I quote here from the continuators of the Chronicle of Theophanes, writing in the 10th century. For indeed, a great fear lay upon Leo's soul on account of a certain prophecy, that on the day of the birth and incarnation of Christ our Lord, his mature prosperity and rule would be cut short. It was a Sibylline oracle that had been squirreled away in a certain book in the imperial library, which did not contain oracles alone, but also the forms and figures and color of those who were to become emperor. Now a ferocious lion was drawn there, with the letter Chi inscribed from its spine to its stomach. A man pursuing the beast delivered a grave blow with a spear through the Chi. This was offered to many for interpretation, but only one man, who held the office of quaestor, clearly stated the meaning, namely, that an emperor named Leo would be given over to a horrible death on the day of Christ's birth. As it was shown in the book, so did it come to pass. Leo was assassinated on Christmas, the victim of a conspiracy led by his successor, Michael II. The story of the old book in the imperial library captured the imagination of later Byzantine historians, who copied it nearly verbatim, and at least one painter. In a manuscript of the Synopsis of Histories by Ioannis Skelitsis, which was copied in Norman Sicily around the year 1150, the actors are arrayed on a single ground line, as if on a stage. The setting is an apsed reception hall. The imperial couple, Leo and Theodosia, sit enthroned in the apse, clad in fineries of gold and purple. The quaestor, who wears a tall white hat and a purple robe, faces them and speaks, while another courtier holds the old book open to the oracle. A third figure, unlabeled, looks on from the rightmost edge. Perhaps he is one of those many who were unable to explain the image. It is an arresting scene in which an emperor hears his death foretold from an ancient book. The blue-robed, bearded courtier holds the volume fully open so that two facing pages are visible, separated by the gutter. On the left page, we see the emblem of the lion at lower left and the hunter on horseback at upper right, the symbolic distillation of the emperor's fate, which the title, written above the book in red, describes, the lion and the one running behind. On the right page, we see a bust portrait in a three-quarters view. The miniature thus contrasts two modes of representing Leo, one symbolic and the other mimetic. We might understand this as the painter's interpretation of the historian's text, according to which the book contained both the forms and the figures, morphos και schemata, of the future emperors. Like the oracular image in general, so too did the story of Leo maintain its interest long past the end of the Byzantine state, both within the Orthodox world and further west. Consider the play Leo Arminius, composed by Andreas Gryphius in 1646 and published in 1650, which tells the story of Leo V once more, over 800 years after his death. Gryphius, the 30-year-old son of a Lutheran archdeacon, based his narrative on the Byzantine historians. His play, an acknowledged masterpiece of the Baroque drama, pivots around the same oracular image, which, however, does not appear on stage. Rather, in the very first scene, one of the conspirators describes a picture in an old and mysterious book, and I quote, "in which, as is thought, everything is chronicled in symbols, that every prince who has ever occupied this throne has done, how long this realm will stand in full blossom, and how in future each prince will rise and fall." He then describes the image of the lion marked for death by a purple cross. "Ich will der Jäger sein," says Michael, the ringleader. "I want to be the hunter." Leo's murder also occurs offstage, and we hear it from a messenger's report, retold as a sacramental allegory. The assassins butcher Leo in church on the feast day of Christ's birth. As Leo vainly parries their blows with a fragment of the true cross, his own blood mixes with that of the Savior in a vividly sacramental fulfillment of the prophecy. In his preface to the play, Gryphius draws a line from the ancient book that foretold Leo's death to his own troubled present. His remarks are, I think, of profound consequence for the long-term history of the oracular image. And I translate, "Indeed, just a few years ago, I myself saw a similar book, full of strange pictures, from which those whose minds are occupied with research into future things have learned much, not least, as they imagine, concerning the reconquest of the once mighty and now, alas, servile city, Constantinople, the fall of the Turks, Christian unity in matters of faith, and the mass conversion of the Jews. And for this reason, no one should consider as entirely vain that which the Byzantine historians, Sonaris and Cadrenus, thought, and which we borrow from them about a most similar book." Just as Gryphius bases his story on a careful reading of the Byzantine historians, so too is his description of the similar book genuine. It recalls, for example, the prophecies or predictions portrayed in 14 pictures that were published in Cologne in 1591 by Gregorio Giordano of Venice, who served as cosmographer to Ernst, Duke of Bavaria. Giordano's astrological calculations had divined a crisis in the year 1595, the consequences of which are plainly depicted in the plates that follow. The fractious rulers of Christendom would find common cause under an elect prince and an angelic pope, and then join forces to eradicate Islam, whose end was foretold by a prophecy found in the tomb of Constantine and depicted here. Giordano's prophecies continue with the baptism of the Sultan by the Pope and conclude when the Antichrist arrives. Thus, like the book that Gryphius saw, Giordano's book foretold a renewal of Christian unity. For example, the Venetian Doge and Russian Tsar, who joined forces here at left, accompanied by an angel. Both books also foretell the fall of the Ottomans, who are represented here by the turbaned Rex Turcarum, king of the Turks, at center right. Moreover, Gryphius's comparison between the similar book and the book in Leo's story is especially apt, as the oracular images that circulated in his day had indeed originated in medieval Constantinople. This image, for example, features both the tomb of the city's founder and at right, an imaginative rendition of one of its prophetic relief columns. Gryphius's drama is therefore a vivid witness to a now unfamiliar, but nevertheless genuine, image of Byzantium. Like ours, so too is his Byzantium defined by its images, not, however, by icons, but by oracles. In place of the image as a means to transcend the mundane and attain the divine, we find the image as an imminent sign of future events here on earth. We do not often discover the secular in Byzantium, which we prefer to identify with the deepest piety and the strictest orthodoxy. Nevertheless, Gryphius's image of Byzantium is authentic. A direct and unbroken line leads from the medieval story of Leo and the ancient book, across the Latin and Ottoman conquests of Constantinople, and up to Giordano's book and Gryphius's play. The common thread is the presence of the oracular image, an image made in the past by human hands that foretells events in the future, and above all, the fates of the sovereigns. Earthly affairs thereby acquire a logic, a form or a pattern that is not rooted in divinity. The oracular image becomes a way of viewing history by imposing a subjective perception of order on a seemingly chaotic succession of events and actions. I turn, therefore, to the second part of the lecture and present a necessarily brief and selective overview of that 1,000-year history. The oracular image, as I have suggested, is a distinctively Byzantine phenomenon. Oracles in classical antiquity were made up of words, not images. Archetypal are the metric utterances of the Sibyls, delivered first in speech and then written down. Similarly, while the books of the Hebrew Bible record many prophetic visions, these are mental images, divinely granted to the prophets, and certainly not man-made artifacts. Although the medium of the oracular image is therefore entirely new, the narrative of Leo nevertheless draws on earlier archetypes, both classical and biblical. As for the classical archetypes, the story recalls those of the tragedians. For example, Sophocles' Oedipus. We can imagine the emperor as playing the king of Thebes, and the quaestor who interprets the image playing the role of the seer, Tiresias. As for the biblical archetypes, the story recalls chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. In this case, we can imagine the quaestor as the prophet Daniel, and Leo as the Babylonian king Balthasar, whose imminent death Daniel reads from the writing on the wall. Daniel was able to interpret the fiery words because of his superior knowledge of Aramaic, the language in which they were written. This aspect of the story is nicely drawn out in a painting by Benjamin West, shown here. We find here all the same elements from the story of Leo: the sovereign, the successful interpreter, and the unsuccessful interpreters, just arranged in reverse order, from right to left. West creates a strong contrast between the confident Daniel and the befuddled magicians, who vainly search their grammars and dictionaries, while Daniel, as it were, sight reads the passage. The comparison therefore raises the interesting question of the questor's expertise in the story of Leo. Why was he alone able to interpret the picture of the hunter and the lion? The answer I would like to suggest is that the questor was an expert in the interpretation of symbolic images, in contrast to the mimetic depictions, we could call them icons, that Byzantine artists are thought to have preferred. I will return to this point in the conclusion of the talk, but let us now move to the later development of the oracular image in Byzantium. After the story of Leo, the next key text involves an emperor of the 12th century, Andronikos I Komnenos. According to the historian Nikitas Koniatis, this emperor commissioned a very strange public portrait of himself, a painting in which he was depicted holding a scythe. Nikitas, the historian, further relates that Andronicus's companions associated him with an old oracle that said, "O scythe-bearer, you have 4 months left, or 4 months remain to you." Andronicus rejected the association, but of course, and as in the case of Leo, it did accurately foretell his demise. Now, this is not explicitly an account of an oracular image. However, we find both the image of the scythe-bearer and the accompanying prophecy in the 16th century manuscripts of the oracles of Leo. Only this time the text is in the first person. "O scythe-bearer, I ascribe 4 months to you." Nor is this the only verse in the oracles of Leo that Koniatis associated with a member of the Komnenian dynasty. The correspondences between the two texts demonstrate that an earlier version of the 16th century oracles of Leo was already circulating in 12th century Constantinople, and that these oracular images, as in the earlier story of Leo V, were understood to foretell the fates of the emperors. The next step in the story of the oracular image involves the transfer of these oracles of Leo from Greek into Latin. In fact, nearly all of the Western manuscripts are considerably older than the preserved Greek manuscripts. The example that I show here today in Lunel dates to the 14th century. Here we find once more the figure of the scythe-bearer and accompanied by the same text, with the Greek verses rendered literally into Latin prose. Notably, the scythe-bearer is now shown in clerical vestments and with a tonsure. He is moreover labeled as Celestine V, who was very briefly Bishop of Rome, namely for 5 months in the year 1294. And indeed, this is the first context in which oracular images appear in Western Christendom, as prophecies not of emperors, but of popes. These papal prophecies were falsely attributed to the Calabrian monk and visionary Joachim of Fiore. And it is in this form that they entered print, in both Latin and vernacular editions. The copy that I show on the left was printed in Bologna in 1515. Here we see once more the scythe-bearer and the accompanying text, which has now been rendered in Italian. This Bologna volume was, in its turn, the direct model for a truly remarkable book that appeared in Germany in 3 separate editions in the year 1527, which were printed in 3 centers of the early Reformation, in Nuremberg, Wittenberg, and Zwickau. Zwickau being the source of the copy that I show here. The volume was called Eine wunderliche Weissagung von dem Papsttum, a marvelous prophecy concerning the papacy. Here we see the scythe-bearer once more, tonsured as he was already in the Lunel manuscript, and clothed in the brown habit of a friar. However, the text, now in German, is no longer a translation of the old poem about the scythe-bearer and his 4 months. Instead, the prose commentary was supplied by the preacher Andreas Osiander, and the verses that accompany it were written by Hans Sachs, the Meistersinger of Nuremberg. They read as follows: "So that you might see who the monk is, he stands there in his habit and has his sign, the rose, in his hand. I think it's Luther. Ich meine, ja, es sei der Luther. For just as Isaiah says in the 40th chapter, all flesh is like grass, so does he stand there with a scythe. And he cuts down not grass, but flesh, and all that is fleshly, for he preaches against it. And after it is uprooted, he will take the fire iron, and with it strike and ignite once more the fire of Christian love, which has been extinguished. Here, for the first time, and in properly Protestant fashion, the interpretation of the oracular image is rooted in Scripture, namely a passage from the prophet Isaiah, which I supply here in yellow. Its message is summarized, finally, in Sachs's verse quatrain at the bottom of the page. It's very sing-songy. Das tät der Held Martinus Luther, der macht das Evangeli lauter. All Menschenlehrer ganz abhaut, und selig spricht, der Gott vertraut. So does the hero Martin Luther, who makes the gospel pure. He chops down all human teaching and pronounces blessed he who trusts God. This wunderliche Weissagung caused a sensation upon its appearance. It was the subject of no fewer than 6 edicts from the Nuremberg City Council, who sought to limit its dissemination among the populace. It also drew the attention of Luther himself, who mentions it in 2 different letters. In the first, which is addressed to his supporter Georg Spalatin, he writes that a booklet, Libellus, containing images that predict the course and fate of the papacy had been printed in Nuremberg. And he adds, we are reprinting, recudemus, the volume, that is to say, in Wittenberg. The second letter is addressed to Wenceslas Link, a friend and former brother of Luther's in the Augustinian monastery. Here Luther writes as follows: nothing new here, nihil novi apud nos, except your booklet of images concerning the papacy, in which I strongly approve of my own image with the scythe, as one who, foretold so many years ago to be cutting and strident, am about to be so. But I hesitate to interpret the rose as my sign. I would have thought that it pertains instead to the office. Here, Luther critiques the claim in the text that the monk has his sign, the rose, in his hand. For Luther, the rose is not his sign, but that of the office, by which I take him to mean the papacy, which he is about to mow down. This is a good point at which to pause and review the trajectory of the oracular image traced thus far. From the Byzantine historians and the books that they described, through the pseudo-Joachimite papal prophecies that circulated in the West in manuscript and in print, and finally to the German and very Protestant Wunderliche Weissagung. In the course of this trajectory, we have seen the same image, that of the scythe-bearer, interpreted as a prophecy of 3 different historical individuals: a Byzantine emperor, Andronikos I Komnenos, a bishop of Rome, Celestine V, and the reformer, Martin Luther. This raises what is for me perhaps the most interesting question about the history of the oracular image. How should we interpret the recurrence of this same picture alongside the continuous changes to its referent? It seems to me that 2 basic approaches are possible. Either the association of the same image with different referents proves the oracle to be fake, an imposture, or it demonstrates its very wide purchase, its ability, namely, to impose a subjective perception of order on a seemingly chaotic succession of events and actions. If we move now to the later 16th century, we will be able to associate these 2 very different approaches with 2 very different individuals. The first is the French essayist, Michel de Montaigne, and the second is the Cretan painter, Georgios Klontzos. Let us begin with Montaigne. Sometime between 1588 and 1592, he sat before a printed copy of the first edition of his own essays and added a marginal remark to his earlier reflections on prognostications. And I quote, I would quite like to have seen with my own eyes these two marvels. The Book of Joachim, the Calabrian abbot, which predicted all the future popes, their names and their forms, and that of the Emperor Leo, which predicted the emperors and patriarchs of Greece. With this wish, Montaigne became, so far as I am aware, the first author to name the oracles of Leo and the prophecies of Joachim as a pair. Compare his source for the remark, which was the French translation of the 15th century Greek historian Laonikos Chalkokondylis. Chalkokondylis does mention both the prophecies of Joachim and the oracles of Leo, but in two entirely unrelated passages that are separated in the translation by some 140 pages. Why did Montaigne bring these two marvels together? And where did his desire come from to compare them side by side? Here we can only speculate, but if we consider the relentlessly ironic tone of this essay, as most of the essays, we could suggest that he suspected their relationship to each other and considered it a proof of their imposture. We are on much firmer ground when it comes to Georgios Klontzis, who was almost an exact contemporary of Montaigne. He was just 2 years younger, and one of the greatest artists active in Venetian-ruled Crete in the second half of the 16th century. Here we are concerned primarily with his codex, what we call the Codex of Georgios Klontzis. This is a leather-bound volume containing 217 paper folios, each measuring roughly 20 centimeters by 15, which Klontzis, with collaborators, executed around the year 1592, probably for his own use. Today, it is held in the Bibliotheca Marciana in Venice. The Codex is an incredibly ambitious world history. It begins with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, and that's the image that you see in the opening here, and concludes with the second coming of Christ, relating in between broad swaths of Jewish, Roman, Byzantine, and above all, Ottoman history. Klontzis, the painter, was intimately familiar with the Byzantine oracles of Leo. Already in the 1570s, almost 20 years previous, he had collaborated on 2 deluxe illustrated copies of the oracles with the humanist scholar Francesco Barozzi. In his codex, Klontzis, like already Barozzi, refers the oracles not to the Byzantine emperors, but to the Ottoman sultans. So the scythe bearer in this case is a fourth individual that we can add to the list, and Suleiman is the scythe bearer in his rendition. But here we see Suleiman's son, Selim II, who reigned from 1566 to 1574. Klontzis depicts him literally astride the oracle of the cow, Ivus, as she is described in the accompanying and traditional Greek verse commentary. This latter includes the line that I highlight here, "For you will enjoy the power for a short while." Consider now another image of Selim II from the same book, a few pages later, this time a full-page drawing. The text in red above and below the scene reads, "Here is fulfilled the prophecy of King Leo the Wise, which says about Selim, 'For you will enjoy the power for a short while.'" The incredibly dense drawing depicts a scene outside a well-defended city, whose walls and troops appear in the background. Just left of center stands Selim, dressed in his sultan's robes and turban, but displaying the head of the cow that foretold him. Selim confronts a relief column and is flanked by 2 figures of death, what appears to be a rotting corpse to the left of him and a leering, scythe-bearing skeleton behind him. To his right appear a Russian Tsar and a Venetian Doge, accompanied by an angel and a winged lion who nips at Selim's robes. The reference, as some of you may have guessed, is the defeat of the Ottoman navy by the fleet of the Holy League at the Battle of Lepanto, Navpaktos, in 1571, which is depicted across the pages directly following. Now, this is an incredibly rich image. Here I will limit myself just to 2 points. The first is thematic, and the second is archaeological. The first point is that the depiction of Selim provides a fitting pendant to the old story of Leo V. Here again, the sovereign faces a prophecy of his own demise, and he does not recognize it. This is the fundamentally tragic theme of the limits on the sovereign's self-knowledge, and it is nicely underlined by placing the oracle of the cow squarely on Selim's shoulders. Selim's fate is clearly visible to everyone except himself. This theme works in concert with what I'm calling the archaeology of the page. For Clonsus's drawing is in fact a composite of multiple oracular images. The first of these sources was identified nearly 20 years ago by the art historian Francesco Sorce. It is none other than the prophetic image by Gregorio Giordano, which we have already seen in the first part of this lecture. Here we find all of the elements in the foreground of Clonsus's drawing, albeit in mirror reverse. The 2 armed Christian rulers and the angel at left, the winged lion of St. Mark, the Ottoman Sultan, here with a human head, and the skeleton and the corpse, the latter labeled in Giordano's image as Muhammad. To Sorce's observation, I can add that the background of Clonsus's drawing also derives from a printed source, namely a bilingual Latin-Italian copy of the Pseudo-Joachimite Papal Prophecies, which was printed in Venice in 1589. Here, Oracle 23, which depicts a walled city, is the direct source for the city in Clonsus's drawing. The exterior walls, the troops on the ramparts, and the landscape of domes and towers within are all direct matches. Once more, however, Clonsus has added something, namely a church with a bell tower, which does not appear in the print. This is in fact one of 2 drawings for which Clonsus has directly drawn on the Venice copy of the prophecies of Joachim. Here is the other one. The conclusion is inescapable, namely that Clonsus had a copy of the volume in his possession in Conducts in 1592. Clonsus's workshop, in other words, is the first library that demonstrably possessed copies both of the Greek oracles of Leo and of the Latin prophecies of Joachim. Clonsus, moreover, clearly fulfilled Montaigne's wish to set these 2 volumes side by side. The full-page drawing of Selim represents that juxtaposition, as it were, in action. The oracle of the cow is set directly on top of the oracle of the city, and the 2 are, as it were, stitched together by Giordano's likewise oracular image. So Clonsus must have recognized that the oracles of Leo and the prophecies of Joachim applied the same images to 2 different subjects. The Ottoman sultans on the one hand, in the way that he interpreted the oracles of Leo, and the Roman pontiffs on the other. He could, of course, have drawn a critical conclusion from this filiation, in which the identity of the 2 series would prove the imposture of both. But that is not what I see in his drawing of Selim, which seems rather to take their identity as its subject, and thereby depict a world that is absolutely thick with signs. This density of signification, as it happens, is central to the 20th century critic Walter Benjamin's account of the Baroque tragedy, in German the Trauerspiel, or mourning play. Benjamin writes of mourning, Trauer, as a state in which the simplest object appears to be a symbol of some enigmatic wisdom. Artistic creation becomes, from this standpoint, the accumulation of such enigmas. Benjamin writes, "It is common practice in the Baroque to pile up fragments ceaselessly, and, in the unremitting expectation of a miracle, to take the repetition of stereotypes for a process of intensification. If we return now to arguably the greatest of all Trauerspiele, the Laoramenius of Andreas Gryphius, we will see that it enacts precisely this accumulation of oracular images in the expectation that art should result. As we've seen, the old book from the Imperial Library appears in the first scene of the first act with its image of the hunter slaying the lion. As in the histories, so too in the tragedy, events come to pass as foretold. And in the preface, finally, Gryphius pauses to reflect on the story that he has told and on the similarity between the books that the Byzantine historians described and those that he knew from his own day. Gryphius here approaches in words the dynamic that appears fully manifest in Claunces's drawing of Selim. The persistence of the oracular images through the centuries, their constantly shifting reference, these are not so much grounds for doubt as promises of meaning. Viewed in this way, Claunces's codex and Glyphius's drama jointly represent the apogee of the oracular image. We see it here fully incorporated into the Baroque aesthetic, even as its Byzantine origin was fully acknowledged. This moment was not to last. The story of the rejection of the oracular image has its predictable elements. It has, for an example, an Enlightenment villain, none other than Edward Gibbon, who in his Decline and Fall dismisses the oracles of Leo as puerile superstition founded on the arts of astrology and divination. The story also, and perhaps equally predictably, has a nationalist episode, here personified by one Petros Stefanitsis of Lefkas. This patriotic doctor published in Athens in 1838 a collection of prophecies, which is dedicated, on the frontispiece, to the future occupant of the throne of Constantinople, and which includes the verse commentaries on the oracles of Leo, which are here said to predict both the devastation and the resurrection of the emperor of the city. Here, in other words, the oracles are subsumed under an irredentist meta-narrative. What is perhaps more interesting is that Stefanitsis' volume omits the actual oracles of Leo, namely the images, treating the verse commentaries instead as if they were self-sufficient. In other words, Stefanitsis preserves the Byzantine origin, but omits the image. We find the reverse process at work in the literature of early Romanticism, where oracular images are everywhere, but their Byzantine origins are forgotten. The earliest example is the novel that Novalis left unfinished at his death in 1801 and was published by his friends in the following year. This tells the story of the medieval bard Heinrich von Ofterdingen, his adventures in travel, and his growth as a poet. In one episode, Heinrich meets a hermit who invites him to peruse his library, and I quote, "At length, Heinrich came across a volume written in a foreign language, which seemed to him to have some similarity to Latin and Italian. He wished most fervently to know the language, for the book pleased him exceedingly without his understanding a syllable of it. It had no title, but as he looked through it, he found several pictures. They seemed wonderfully familiar to him, and as he looked more sharply, he discovered a rather clear picture of himself among the figures. He was startled and thought he was dreaming, but after looking at it repeatedly, he could no longer doubt the complete similarity. He hardly trusted his senses when soon after he discovered in another picture the cave and the hermit, that is to say, whose very library he perused." End of quote. Heinrich goes on to discover representations of his travels, even as he finds the last pictures in the book to be dark and unintelligible. When the hermit returns, Heinrich asks him about the book and learns that it was written in Provençal. This passage in Novalis represents, as it were, the second birth of the oracular image, namely in the guise of a romantic trope, in which an image made in the past foretells the hero's career. We find a more fully developed version of the theme in E.T.A. Hoffmann's 1815 novel, Die Elixiere des Teufels, whose entire plot revolves around just such an image, which in this case represents the martyrdom of Santa Rosalia of Palermo and is said to have been painted by a pupil of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, this is not the only case in which a central theme in modern European literature turns out to have a Byzantine origin. I think, for example, of the Faust legend, which can with good grounds be traced back to the Byzantine story of the magician Heliodorus. And yet, I would wager that neither Goethe's Faust nor Hoffmann's Elixiere des Teufels feels particularly Byzantine to us today. By way of conclusion, therefore, I would like to ask how a rediscovery of the oracular image might change our idea of the Byzantine. Over the decade or more that I have been thinking about these oracular images, I have come to see them as mirror reverses of Byzantine icons. Icons, as we all know, are transcendent. Their prototypes are divine in origin, and they provide us with access to the divine. The oracular image, by contrast, is fully immanent. It is human in origin, and it reveals the logic of human affairs, the rise and fall of rulers and states. Icons, moreover, work by mimesis. They directly show the person whom they represent. This principle was articulated already by the bishops of the Quinisex Council in 692, when they declared that the figure of Christ our God should be set forth in images in human form, instead of the ancient lamb. The oracular image, by contrast, takes up precisely that disavowed symbolic mode of representation. The story of the reception of the Byzantine icon in early modern Europe is hugely important. How, namely, it became associated with authenticity, faithfully relaying the true face of Christ from his day to ours. And yet, as I hope to have shown this evening, the oracular image supplies a kind of counterpoint to that more familiar story. Radically different in its origins and its effects, it too was seen as Byzantine by Montaigne and Gryphius. Only after its oblivion in the 18th and 19th centuries did the image of Byzantine art become fully subsumed under the notion of the holy. Despite the widely varying individual judgments that modern authors have passed on Byzantine art, the discourse of the icon is marked by at least one constant, the consensus regarding its transcendence. This consensus is multiply grounded in reality, in the profundity and continuing interest of Byzantine image theory, and in the genuinely moving effects of Byzantine portraits. However, it has also served to assign a limited and highly selective role to Byzantium within the history of art. One can and should criticize the continuing tendency to judge Byzantine art on the basis of its contributions to the West. But my goal this evening has been different. I have wanted to show that even when we adopt a European view on Byzantine art, the story of the Byzantine icon remains radically incomplete without its uncanny double, the oracular image. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I welcome your comments and your observations, and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much. And on a personal note, thank you very much for taking us to Crete. This codex, the Klonzas Codex, it's truly amazing. But thank you really for taking on a topic, a theme that is interesting, exciting, and for really making it into something even more exciting and controversial, maybe, in terms of what how you spoke about it as a mirror to, or the antithesis of the icon. So I will stop babbling and ask for questions from the audience, if there are any.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. Could you tell us what is the earliest mention in print of the story of Leo?
The earliest mention in print of the story of Leo would be in those sources, the 16th century editions of the Byzantine historians that Gryphius is drawing on. So he's drawing explicitly on Zonaras and Cadrenus. I don't have it entirely in my head, but it would be in those Greek editions with the Latin translations of the Byzantine historians that it first appears in print.
That is, this would be available to people who did not read Greek.
So
but of the Greek historians,
these 16th century editions of the Byzantine historians are usually published with a Latin translation.
yes, of course.
So I don't know if Gryphius himself was reading it in Greek or in Latin, but it was usually the Latin that was making it available. The Chalcogondylis is unusual because it's a vernacular translation, which we don't get a lot of until later centuries. But certainly the Latin made it accessible to many more, especially churchmen, who might not have had the Greek to be able to read it in the original.
So that the transmission was in fact in manuscript form from, let us say, a contemporary story of a period of the story of Leo?
Exactly. Right. So we don't even have a contemporary version of this story. We have one contemporary historian of Leo V's reign. This is this anonymous historian, the Scriptor Incertus, and he doesn't mention the story of the oracle. So it's first these 10th century historians, the continuaries of Theophanes, but also Ignatius, who give these slightly different versions of the story of Leo and the image that foretold his death.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So I was going to ask, what are your boundaries for defining a Byzantine image? Because a little later in the Continuatus, there is an anecdote of an earthquake, and which happens right after the assassination of Bardas. And Leo the Grammaticus is like, okay, so the next emperor is also going to go because the statue of an emperor falls during the earthquake. So is the statue an image? Is an earthquake an image? Do you see resonance of that? Yeah.
It's a great question. Thank you, James. So we have stories like that already in the Roman historians. So that story of Bardas, and there are other Byzantine examples as well. And it's related. It's one of these earlier bits of culture that's being kind of reassembled to create the idea of the oracular image. But I don't classify them as being oracular images in the robust sense because I would consider them omens. So it's not the statue itself that foretells the earthquake, or that foretells Bardas's fate in this case. It's the fact that it's toppled in the earthquake. And this we already have in some of the paradoxographic Roman writers, similar kinds of stories about statues being toppled that foretell the death of such and such an emperor. So the distinction that I'd make there, it's a good question, where to sort of draw the boundaries. The distinction that I would make is that in the case of these properly oracular images, it's the interpretation of the image itself. It's not the thing that happens to it. But I think that those are really great examples that there's also this famous story, for example, of the Empress Zoe and the icon of Christ Antiphonitis, which changes color and thereby foretells to her future events. Again, this is something sort of alongside and related to, but not fully representative of what I'm calling the oracular image. There again, you have ancient examples, in the Roman historians of images that by nodding or by some sort of gesture, foretell future event statues in all of those cases. So similar working up to, but it's the interpretation is in any of these cases of something that the image does or something that befalls it, not the image itself, as in the case of the book in the library.
Okay, and just in the case of a selfish follow-up, how do you draw the line between that and miraculous icons that also do stuff and urge people in a certain way, like they start weeping and so on?
Right. So those two, I think you can fit in this longer-term history of sacred images that, Lucian's on the Syrian goddess has stories about images that similarly, react in emotional fashion. And so that, I think, very important story, but actually a much longer story. This thing that happens around 800 is that suddenly it's just the interpretation of the image itself. So it's strictly speaking not anything to do with the supernatural. I guess that's why I wanted to sort of insist on this. To understand how that icon changes color, how that statue nods and so forth, that's a notion that there is some divine involvement suddenly. Whereas when it's just a book that you find in the library and using your wits, you can interpret its meaning, it removes that element of the supernatural or of the divine in the operations and the efficacy of the image.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this very rich talk. Give us a lot of things to think about. I was wondering, I have a related question to what was said before. I was wondering would you agree that I'm sure you thought of this, but let me throw it in the conversation. Have you thought of maybe that the prototypical oracular image for the Byzantines, but also for the Western Europeans of the 17th and 18th century, would have been the statue that appears in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and its interpretation? And there are also visual depictions of this also from Byzantium that we have not only discussions of it. So how would you say does that fit in your understanding of the oracular image?
Yeah, that's a great question. Daniel, various chapters of Daniel stand behind various elements of the oracular image. There's no question. And so I underlined to hear more of the writing on the wall, but I think also this statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream is, again, one of these elements, like these omens in the Roman historians and so forth, which combine in order to create a kind of a background, a kind of a plausibility for this concept of the oracular image. So to play the same game with your question, Stratis, that I did with James's question earlier, I'd say, again, it's not a proper oracular image because it's a dream. It's not an artifact, right? That statue doesn't actually exist. Well, of course, there is a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, but that statue is not oracular, right? The statue in that foretells the kingdoms is just something that appears to him in a dream. So in a sense, it's like many of the other prophetic visions of the Hebrew prophets, that is a mental image that is perhaps somehow divinely granted.
But what do you do when it's visualized?
When somebody then draws it, right. That's interesting. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question because then by, I guess, interpreting that image, at least one of these kingdoms is still to come. So perhaps you could say that through the proper interpretation of one of these depictions of Nebuchadnezzar's statue, this is functioning in the same way that the oracular images do. But I don't know that people went to those images in order to understand what happened in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, right? If they actually want to understand what happened in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, they go to the text. And the image, but it's nice. We're getting closer, I think, to another sort of. I'll have to look at that. I haven't looked at at Byzantine depictions of that. It's a nice line of inquiry to follow up.
thank you, Ben, for this amazing talk. I'm really intrigued by this shift that you've identified in the earlier Greco-Roman delivery of oracles through text, right, and verse, especially oftentimes, that needs interpretation and is oftentimes catastrophically misinterpreted. So why, can you tell us more about why we might imagine this shift taking place when it does, and why we're becoming interested in the oracular interpretation of images when you see it begin? Thanks.
Yeah, it's such a good question. So why? And an obvious question that I have not attempted to address at all in this presentation. So it's a big missing piece of the puzzle, and I'm never sure entirely how I want to approach it. It does require getting into the moment, the century in Byzantine history that we call the period of iconoclasm. And so Leo V is known, among other things, for being the emperor who reintroduces iconoclasm after the iconophile interregnum. So there would be an easy answer, I think, which is, I think, not the answer, but it's worth sort of naming it here, that in this instance, in the story of Leo V, this is kind of the revenge of the images on the iconoclast emperor. The reason I don't think that's what's going on here is in one of the versions, so another one of these 10th century historians, whom we call Pseudo-Simeon, who also tells the same story, he names the quaestor, the person who interprets the image. And he's somebody named Stephanos Kapitolitis, who we know from other contexts and who seems with very good grounds to have been actually one of these iconoclast intellectuals. So the author of some of the verses, the iconoclast epigrams that Leo V had posted on the gates of the imperial palace. So I think in its initial context, this story does not have this resonance that it probably later gains, that it's the images having their revenge on an iconoclast emperor. Instead, it's much more this older dynamic of the bureaucrat who understands the affairs of state and understands the emperors better than the emperors themselves understand themselves. I mean, I think that's the underlying dynamic there, but it still leaves aside this question of why in this moment there's a shift in medium, and the artifact, the sort of graven image, becomes a legitimate medium for an oracle, and it's underlined by the fact that it's also in the 8th century and also in the period of iconoclasm that we have the first texts that go and interpret the statues in the streets of Constantinople. So this is, in a sense, an entirely different but clearly related parallel story, and those are oracular images. If you do have a certain expertise, you can understand the fates of the emperors by interpreting the statues and the spiral relief columns around the city. So the manuscripts and the statues reinterpreted in this sense appear both around the same time. That needs some kind of answer, and I haven't yet been able to formulate it in a way that convinces me what seems to be the most obvious answer, which is that it has something to do with iconoclasm, that in this moment, even if it's not a strict one-to-one, that the images foretell the end of the iconoclast emperor, that it is the intellectual climate of this period, that there's a kind of focus on an intense sort of preoccupation with images, the ways in which they can signify, that also makes this possible. But I have to say that remains sort of unsatisfying to me. And I think it's primarily the reason that I'm stuck basically halfway through chapter 3 of the manuscript of this book, which is where I feel like I ought to be able to offer a better answer to this question.
Thank you.
Of course.
So thank you for your fascinating talk. I wonder if there isn't a conceptual link to the astrological chart. Mm-hmm. The astrologer draws up the chart, right? And it's very visual. Mm-hmm. And that then becomes a type of oracular image. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you think about that.
It's a really interesting idea, and we have those charts already in the Roman astrologers, so they would definitely, they would be available also, to Byzantine intellectuals in this period. And again, especially in the 8th and 9th century, there's an intense interest in astrology. So it's definitely part of the milieu. And the other reason that it has a certain appeal is because that's also, although it's celestial, it is in a sense similarly secular as a way of interpreting the future to these oracular images. That's to say, you don't really need a divinity for astrology to work. Astrology can be a purely materialist science. So it's a really nice idea, and I'd have to think some more about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, that was just great. And as a Romanist, I have to throw in a little Roman thing. Could you talk again the origin of the sickle or the scythe? Can you go into that? Because one thing that it was reminding me of something, and I'm thinking of the image of a Roman augur holding the lituus. And is there any chance of this being, I don't want to say mistaken, but creatively appropriated for this image?
No, that's a really neat question. Thank you. And again, something that's exactly the reason that it's great to come and give a talk, because these ideas are fantastic, and many of them are ideas that I haven't previously thought of. It opens up this. So for that, I don't know. I haven't thought about that or looked at it. It does open up this question, though, about the sort of the origins of these symbols and the vocabulary of the iconography of this. Sort of set of images, which is sometimes incredibly literal. So in the case of the story of Leo, it's a lion, Leo, and he has this chi for Christmas, and the hunter spears him through this. And you sort of ask yourself, well, how is it that nobody was able to understand this previously, right? It doesn't seem nearly as recherché as this sort of alternative, conjugation of the Aramaic that you get in the story of Daniel. So in that sense, it doesn't necessarily line up. And it's the same, in the later Byzantine, the third story that I didn't mention, but it gives me an opportunity to do it here. That's to say that Nikephoros Gregoras writes about Andronikos II, so one of the Paleologan emperors. This is the third example in the historians of this kind of image. And again, Andronikos's death was foretold by an image in a book. And in that case, he was sitting on a chair. And this has this incredibly sort of mundane and disappointing conclusion, which is that he ends up dying on the toilet. And so this was what was foretold in the image that, again, nobody was able to interpret previously, although it seems in a sense fairly straightforward. And that's what, in that case, Gregoras comments that, in fact, it seems strange that we can only understand these images after the fact has come to pass. So it's hardly ever the case. We only have these three stories, basically, of the oracular images being interpreted in the Byzantine contexts. And there, it's hardly ever the case that somebody comes up with what seems to us today like a really clever, esoteric interpretation of what's in the images. It seems to have this fairly, sort of straightforward kind of one-to-one. Sometimes it's kind of wordplay. Sometimes, it doesn't stand far from what's actually sort of represented on the page. But that doesn't mean that we can't now wonder about these images, what were the elements that went to make them up? And they're very different to each other. So sometimes, like with the scythe bearer, it's a person. Sometimes it's an animal. Sometimes it's multiple animals. There's the image of the she-bear who's suckling her cubs. So there's these various, and then in the later accretions of this tradition, you get things that are inanimate, like the city, for example. So there's not a clear logic that connects all of these images together in terms of what constitutes their significance, or what the sort of the iconography of the oracular image is. I think that remains an open question.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I don't see any other hands, so I think we can release you and go downstairs for a glass of wine. And thank you very, very much for the talk and the discussion. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you. This is really exciting. It's the first.